Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, welcome to the New Books Network. I am your host, Stephen Sakevich. My next guest is Paddy Walker, and we will be discussing his book, War Without Oversight: Why We Need Humans on the Battlefield, published by Howgate Publishing in 2025. Formally commissioned into the 5th Royal Inniskillian Dragoon Guards, Dr. Paddy Walker is Managing Director of the Leon Group. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Humanities Research Institute at the University of Buckingham, an Associate Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute, and an Associate at the Institute for the Public Understanding of War and Conflict at the Imperial War Museum. Previously, he was London Chair of the NGO Human Rights Watch. Paddy Walker is now a board member of NGO Article 36 and co-authored War's Changed Landscape, also published by Howgate, with Professor Peter Roberts in 2023. This was also the subject of a previous episode of the New Books Network hosted by myself. Paddy Walker, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you very much for having me for the second time in about 12 months. So thank you.
Yes, our last one was a very interesting discussion. We do encourage our listeners to listen to that one as well, including this one. We
Good.
always like to begin our interviews by asking our guests, tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the backstory behind writing this book.
Good. So thank you. This is coming to you from London, a warm London. We're having unseasonably warm weather. My name is Paddy Walker, Dr. Paddy Walker. My PhD a while ago was around machine learning in autonomous weapon systems. And the book that we're going to discuss today, which is War Without Oversight: Why We Need Humans on the Battlefield, comes from various contextual drivers over the last few years. So I'm ex-forces, so a long time ago was in the cavalry and delicious things called tanks on the Westphalian plain in Germany. In the days of those sort of very well understood, nicely designated enemies rolling across in the German border. I subsequently left that and went into academia and business. So I come at this from a forces angle. Undoubtedly. But I also come at it looking at the sort of technical foundation, whether or not machine learning is an appropriate technical spine to create these weapons that are not going to have human oversight. Now, there are lots of arguments here. A lot of them are well trailed. My background is I'm a fellow at RUSI, which is the Royal United Services Institute here in the UK. It's the largest and the oldest of the military think tanks. I do have a slight axe to grind in that I was also chaired the London Committee of Human Rights Watch and come at it from the NGO angle, looking at the ethics and also the legality, the laws of armed combat, which I'm sure we'll get onto here. So lots of these arguments are well trailed: the legal, the moral, the societal. I think what I've tried to do here in this book is to identify the technical challenges, those sort of pinch points, and also the behavioral challenges to creating autonomous weapons. And what does that mean? So basically removing supervision. Can you give the decision to kill to an algorithm? And if you open your browser today and you type in autonomous weapons, there's this wonderful expression which Philip Sabin, Professor Sabin here at KCL, has created. It's around this revolution in expectation. You see it on a podcast, you hear it on a podcast, you see it on a video, whatever. You've watched Terminator, and so therefore you just think that these things are going to roll over the hill and that they are possible. So there is this existing thoroughly deterministic view, and to the degree that there's any originality in the book that we're discussing today, it's really trying to debunk some of these, the obviousness of autonomous weapons. So we'll, I'm sure, talk about autonomous decision aids, and we're seeing them working, whether that's with the IDF in Israel or such like. But there's a great leap between that and actually having useful assets that are independent, somewhat sentient, don't like to use the word sentient, but somewhat independent, that the procurers, that the colonel who is responsible on the front line can actually use as an asset to achieve his or her objective. So there are two strap lines here. There is war without oversight, why we need humans on the battlefield. So that's the first one. But inside, it's really also intended as a primer on the challenges to the deployment of these weapon systems. So it is therefore looking at the technical, the behavioral. I'm going to also talk about the sort of the institutional frictions that exist there. So just to answer your question, left the army, went to business school. I was one of those very dangerous early coders in the early 90s. So sort of understand a little bit, a dangerously small amount about some of the architecture here. So I'm a dangerous amateur. But then I've also spent the last 20 years investing as a family office executive, investing in all of this stuff. So I am interested in the sort of the technical ephemera around this. And the genesis of my work here really comes from Human Rights Watch a long time ago now, 2012, which to my horror is 13 years ago. Human Rights Watch came out with a rather pejoratively named report, Killer Robots, and it was really the first sort of siren wake-up call about how supervision was being eroded around lethal engagements and how that might actually impact on the laws of armed combat. And on the back of that, I did a master's and a PhD later on, as I said, a RUSI fellow. And then our last conversation with Peter Roberts, Professor Peter Roberts, and we looked really slightly at 40,000 feet. This is the one we're talking about today, is at 20,000 feet. So that 40,000 feet look around norms and forms of warfare and how they were changing, and whether or not there has been a discontinuity. Of course, on our back door here, we've got Ukraine, and whether or not that is a revolution in military affairs, which are, the rise of the drone, which we I'm sure we'll talk about. I don't think that is the case. It's just another way of killing people. But so that is the genesis of what we're going to be discussing today.
Now, just for some of our listeners who are not familiar with this term, or they're kind of confused about what it means, could you give us like a brief summary or definition of what you mean by autonomous weapon systems? You also mentioned early in the book that it can be difficult to precisely define these along with artificial intelligence. Could you just give us like a brief introduction?
Yeah, so that is, of course, a wonderful question. And that is evidenced by the fact that following that Killer Robots report by Human Rights Watch, so all of this is discussed in the United Nations, around this rather strange organ called the CCW, the Convention for Conventional Weapons. And there are, however many there are, 174 signatories, more than that, I think, of the Geneva Convention, 13 years later, and they have yet to be able to decide and define what is that autonomous weapons system. Unfortunately, that your question is the nub of it all. For my purposes here, you are looking, I like the aphorism, can you give the decision to kill to an algorithm? And that's really it. So it's not the human in or about or on the loop, it's the human out of the loop. You're asking these machines, weapons, autonomous weapons, but let's call them machines, to identify a target, process that targeting information, bring in all of the constraints that those machines must have in their decision processes before spitting out a lethal engagement. So it's a machine that must be able to sense, and then on the back of that sense data, act unilaterally without a human. So that is the first overarching principle here. I think also useful is that the machine has got a learning angle. We need to talk about the learning part of this. So it is being able to understand, with a very small u, understand what is a known case in front of it and project that forward into what is the present case in front of that machine. So it's the notion of training the system, training the weapon to make decisions. And we'll definitely pick on that when we start talking about data and the probabilistic nature of these machines and algorithms in arriving at these decisions. So the decisions, I think, is that the decision part is key, the independent decision part. Also, for me, is really this target acquisition. You are asking the weapon to make independent acquisition. And so what does that mean, acquisition? It's the why that target might the asset of interest is why that is of interest, where it is, when that transaction, the engagement should happen, and how that engagement should happen. So it's that whole very involved target acquisition process which is happening independent, outside human supervision, probably in a communications denied environment. So all of the intelligence has got to be placed on the machine. It's not good enough to do it on the edge, that processing, or take it off, or have a human involved in that. It is doing it itself. And it is then initiating lethality without that human supervision. And to pick up the second part of your question, why that is difficult, because all of these changes, decisions, and whatever, they are incremental. None of the data that these machines are relying upon in order to make those decisions, it doesn't arrive conveniently in a nice block that we all understand. It's nicely labeled. All of this is arriving piecemeal. The data is probably duplicatory, it's missing bits, it's contradictory, it's difficult. Agency, which we'll discuss later on, is not clear cut. So it may be that part of the weapon system has its own agency, but then there is human oversight in another part of that weapon system. So none of that is necessarily clear. It's all moving very fast, both the landscape and the technology. And we often hear that much of the technology is dual use. But actually, that in itself, I think, obfuscates, dilutes some of the, that clear lines of delineation. It's really difficult to understand and abstract what is the responsibility of the machine. And then there's this sort of plausible deniability. So anyone using these machines is very easy to just deny that either they're being used, or to sidestep responsibility and accountability. And that, I think, sort of makes this thing complicated. Lots of hybrid models of adoption is not a clear model of adoption. This is a future-oriented subject that we're discussing today. We don't yet have really good examples of independent autonomous weaponry. We've got loitering weapons that I'm sure we'll speak about. We've got these decision aids, but we don't have weapons that I am delegating my right flank to, that I'm looking to do a particular job. So lots of hybrid, which again makes it difficult to define. And just generally, the difference between something that's automatic, something that's got automaticity, something that is autonomous, it's been clouded by what happens with cars and independent cars, and I think that is the same really in weapon system as well. It doesn't have nice shiny edges that we can sort of adhere to, and then I think that point of isolation is interesting, especially if you're on the receiving end of an autonomous weapon. Again, it's not obvious, and they're not just going to be an autonomous weapon. It's going to be multi-domain. It's going to be all sorts of stuff coming at you, some of which will have various levels of autonomy. So altogether, quite difficult.
Kind of goes back to the underlining nature of war being very chaotic and uncertainty that even Clausewitz talked about, but it's in a new form in a way, or norm. Getting back to our previous discussion.
Yeah.
Now, you open the book with the first recorded robot-only military maneuver in Ukraine. How do you see this moment as defining in terms of future conflicts? And do you think it represents a point of no return for autonomous weapons?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So this happened actually Christmas Eve, 24th of December, Ukraine, and it was the first multi-domain use of entirely robotic assets. Quite a small engagement, but nevertheless not involving any human, if you like, ostensibly in that engagement. And of course, going back to that revolution in expectation, of course, there are humans all over that piece. So, yes, defining in terms of conflict, but not as we were speaking before, you're not any revolution in military affairs, not a particular discontinuity, and certainly not an autonomous weapons system cohort, because all of those, whether they were ground-based or drone-based, so aerial systems, there were individuals, either first-person view or back at home base, who were orchestrating and curating that engagement. So I think the question, we will talk about context. I think so. Um, it's all in the context of Ukraine or whatever. I think what's useful for that example is that it does reinforce some of the framework and the research questions behind this book. So it's really about the feasibility. So that engagement in December makes it look as though it is all wonderfully feasible. But absent shorn of that human oversight, none of that happens. So, do not mistake what happened in December for any type of battlefield, battlecraft that involves autonomy without humans. So it's really that research question about feasibility. It's about the models that we were talking about and how you're actually going to introduce these assets into battlecraft and how to adopt it. And I think, interestingly, it will in time be, because it's difficult as a futurist to go, look, we're never going to have autonomous weapons, because, clearly that we're on a roll there, we're on a rip. And later in this call, we'll talk about some of the enduring challenges to actually, unpacking your box on a Tuesday morning and taking out an autonomous weapons system. I think more appropriate is to look at that engagement in December and see what is the likely fit between what is possible with these weapon systems and the tasks that are appropriate by the in situ commander, and also laying on top of that the rules of engagement and laws of armed combat, but certainly the rules of engagement, and how, with a Venn diagram, you can get these three components: what is possible, what is useful, but then the constraints placed upon the local commander, and see if there's any common area there. And then I'm sure we'll talk about the role of meaningful human control here, but to what degree do you actually want, and is it interesting to remove humans from this process? So just to back up to answer your question again, I'm reminded, so we've got this individual who's emeritus professor at robotics up at Sheffield, called Noel Sharkey, Professor Sharkey, who's been in this vertical for a year and a day, forever and ever. But it's not deterministic. It is not obvious, for several reasons that we'll discuss later, I'm sure, that there's a sort of deterministic output here. It is a matter of feasibility and utility, and the December episode that you're discussing does not yet answer the questions whether or not, whether they're feasible or whether they're actually useful. And so, yes, just bear in mind for the rest of this conversation those enduring technical and behavioral frictions that actually set these things back.
Now, part of what you just answered, there's also what you call the dangers of presentism and neophilia when discussing autonomous weapon systems. What do you mean by that, and why is it dangerous?
Yes, so that's that also related to our last podcast, Stephen. So I can just knock this off very quickly, and your listeners, it's pretty obvious actually when defined. So that presentism, if I'm right, is it basically assumes for the reader, for the person who's commenting on autonomous weapon systems, that today is, a period of unprecedented current turbulence. And so, everything is difficult and tricky and moving very quickly against, so I left the army, years back in the last century, and it's that sort of that exaggerated tranquility of the past. So that is presentism, and you've really got to, to fight against that. And then that neophilia that you mentioned, it's just that, it's an extension of that really. And it's, what is being observed today, whether or not it's that robotic engagement in December, is entirely novel. So it is novel, but to what degree is that important? And so, hence this whole matter of context. And so there are the sort of two issues that you've just, if you're commenting on these developments, that has got to be in the back of your mind, so you don't give weighting to a matter that doesn't deserve it such.
And even going back to Ukraine, we're also seeing that while we're also seeing like this operation that was robot only, what we're also seeing is the use of older kits, even going back to World War II by both sides. I've heard about even Mosin Nagant rifles being used and so forth. So it's almost like it's not really necessarily just the new, it's integrating the new with the old, and it's not either or, it's more like kind of a trying to maintain a balance almost.
I think that's right. It's all about lethality and how you are going to deliver the blow or deflect the blow that is coming at you, and whether or not you use new means or repurposed old means. And there's a great expression called nullification. So this is Max Boot's theory of nullification, and that is that the first time that you see something like an autonomous weapon system at you, you are stymied, and it is very effective. But human ingenuity is such that second or third time there may be some quite low tech that can actually defeat high tech. And whether that is like simply digging a trench in front of this oncoming autonomous land robot, or spraying paint or putting wires. There are lots of ways that actually that perhaps some of this high tech, very expensive high tech, which is very fragile, we'll come on to later, can be defeated. So I think you're right with that.
Yes, even going back to World War One when the tanks were first introduced, then the Germans just built bigger rifles to just penetrate the armor and take them out.
That's correct, but then alternatively, then the British at Calnborough, they start moving the glacis plate, which is that front piece of hard armor, in order to try and deflect the projectile. If the projectile doesn't penetrate, then of course it doesn't do much to the tank. So you're always trying to wobble that projectile to stop it penetrating. So yeah, of course, but that's a good example of ingenuity defeating high tech.
So you mentioned already the importance of context. Can you elaborate on this point in more depth?
Yeah, so what context is, I think, a misunderstood, underweighted notion when looking at these matters. So, for me, I think that the context, and there's a whole chapter of context in this book, and actually in the earlier book with Peter Roberts. It's really providing the prism, the lens through which you can, as I said before, you can weight the components of the debate. If you don't understand where it sits, and you simply look at, oh my goodness, in December there were robots trundling across the ground, and albeit a small section, platoon level of Russians were pushed back. That is new warfare. Well, not necessarily in the broader context of all of that. We've talked about this revolution in expectation, and here it's context that helps you look at what is possible versus what is reasonable versus what is probable. So I like that continuum. Possible, you've seen it in a film, maybe possible, but actually what is reasonable, and then after all of the frictions that we'll talk about, what is probable. And I think that it is context that gives you the lens to do that. And then, of course, everything that you read and see has got versos. They've got, alternative ways to look at all of this stuff. Frictions abound with all of this, whether it's with procurement, whether it's integration. It will posit a new way of doing warfare if you start removing humans. So guess what? You've got to have a whole new doctrine, and good luck with delivering that in such a fast-moving environment. And it's the delivery both of doctrine, but the delivery. I use this device, which I like in the book, called the delivery cohort. And it is that huge, deep, complex, frictional body of humankind that is needed to deliver these weapons. So whether that is politicians at the top going down to procurement, going down to those who finance it, who manufacture it, the lawyers, the data scientists, the coders, and then it is the sergeant major, he or she who's on the tank park, who's actually going to have to unwrap these things, configure them, and deliver them. And that is very, very complicated. The tooth and nail ratio is much misunderstood. And I discuss this in some detail in the book. In olden days with the American Reaper and such like, but even today, and even looking forward to what is happening in Ukraine, the footprint, the human footprint that you require in order to reduce humans up front in battle is actually, it's an extraordinarily detailed and complex management piece, but also it takes up a lot of bodies as well. So it's the training, it's all of those behavioural ticks like inertia. The sergeant major who's been on the tank park, guess what? He or she is quite a busy person. They don't have either time, they've got muscle memory, they're ending their career, they may be responsible for training, but without that, rinse and repeat, and this whole new weapon system coming in, there's all sorts of frictions to doing that. And again, politics, media, when these things go wrong, they have to be deployed. You can't deploy them and trial them. Anything that's doing a lethal engagement has to be taken out of the box and be ready and be right first time and every time. And if you get that wrong, the media response, and therefore the politician who's obviously concerned about whether or not he or she will be elected again. And also it's the economics of these things. They're going to be very expensive. A human is expensive, but is less expensive than all of these things. So there are three contextual assumptions that I use for this book. First of all, I'm trying to investigate weapons autonomy. And because it's a fast-moving landscape, I didn't want to alight on any one particular named platform like the Lancet or the Turkish drone systems or whatever. So three assumptions. First of all, that what I am looking at are weapons that have whole independence. In other words, they can operate out of the box, they're configured, off on that Tuesday that we were talking about, off they go and do their stuff. They are wholly independent. They are also have wide task capability. So that gets round that bit of agency just being in a part of the weapon system. What I am looking at is to try and isolate the difficulties about wide task capabilities. And I thought throughout this process that if I ever had to mention the word Terminator, I have failed. But that would be a wide task capable machine. And then the last assumption, which is really important, and it's a point really from Peter Roberts that he labours, and that is that the right of combatants, their means and methods, is not unlimited. So is the laws of armed combat, are those laws a Western construct that nobody else listens to and pays any attention to? For my book, I have assumed that the Geneva Convention and all their signatories thereof, that means something. And so proportionality, distinction, military necessity, the Martin Clause being within the dictates of human conscience, the ideas of force, being actively protecting civilians, Clause 57, that to me is a that fetters and constrains the means and methods of competence. Now, if you look at Russia, that may not be the case, but for the assumption here, within context, that is what we're working towards.
Now, you argue that autonomous weapon systems challenge fundamental military principles. Uh, what do you argue as the most overlooked but crucial challenge? Technical, ethical, or legal? You did kind of touch on this before, but can you go in more depth?
Yeah, goodness, I can go. I mean, that really is the nub of the book here. So we've got various questions to go through today. This is probably the most involved one. So I will spend a little bit of time here, and then we'll try and shortcut that with you later on in this call. So look, first of all, once deployed, these systems, were they to be deployed, they do posit a significant change in how war is waged. You're not going to have humans round about, and you're going to have machines making these decisions, undertaking these decisions, and then dispensing lethality. So, if that is the case, we talked about the doctrine part, but there are severally long held tenets, if you like, that are no longer fit for purpose. So that is the context, and that is how the lens that we should look through here. There are challenges. I think there are structural challenges, and there are technical challenges, and there are probably some behavioral challenges as well. So let's just quickly cut them, just tick them off. So laws of armed combat, we mentioned what they are, but they are difficult. Again, difficult to abstract. They don't have nice shiny surfaces. Proportionality, it is essentially subjective whether or not a particular target is worth a certain amount of collateral damage, and also it's dynamic. It changes from moment to moment. So if you, Stephen, make that decision at 11 o'clock this morning, guess what? Half an hour later, it is obsolete, and you need to be revisiting that if you are going to be within the laws of armed combat. There are systemic underlying foundational mismatches here, I think. And it's very difficult to code for ambiguity. And the example I tend to use is Norway's recently reissued its rules of armed combat, rules of engagement, ROE, and I can't remember, is it 1,300 pages long or some such? But actually trying to code for the ambiguity and the nuances of the wonderful Martin's Clause, that anything that is undertaken on battlecraft is within the dictates of human conscience. Now, good luck with trying somehow to impose that notion on the aims, goals, values of an autonomous weapons system that is operating independent of human supervision. Matters, I think, structural challenges of accountability and human dignity as well. So they are enshrined in IHL, and if you are adhering to that, that is a very difficult issue to code for and take notice of if a machine is going to be doing this without a human. And we've talked about plausible deniability. And I think if we look then at some of the technical challenges here, these are machines, weapons, that rely for their operation on data. It is data that allows them to action processes. So let's just go a little bit deeper. We touched on it before, but it's how that data is identified, what's the right data, when is the right data, how often is the weapon going to be polling, POLLING, taking in, and updating its initial representation to take account for this new sensed data. And the collection of management of this is really complicated. It's computationally expensive. In olden days, we had to label this data in order to try and get it into a state that the machine which has got its data training set, it's then trying to to work off that data training set and look at what it is facing at the moment, that sense data, and then use that with a utility function. So, what is the best way of me, the machine, achieving my mission? What's the highest utility? And these things are complicated to do. They're complicated to do for a university bench, lab bench, and they are complicated for commercial entities to be doing it around, for instance, the mobile phone or whatever. But it's not yet. As soon as you do this in an adversarial field of battlecraft, where you have got an adversary who is deliberately trying to manipulate that data, change that data, feint, F-E-I-N-T, feint, spoof, and such like, that data becomes very difficult. For you and I, it's quite easy for us to backfill gaps or duplicatory or contradictory data, or obsolete data. It's quite easy for us to understand that doesn't look, a smell test doesn't look quite right. But that is very difficult for a machine to do. And we talked about how often it's going to poll that data, but how do you attenuate the machine, the weapon, to say that is interesting data and you should focus your attention on that, but not on elsewhere? That sort of cocktail party effect, where you and I are at a party or whatever, we sort of have a background understanding of the context of what's happening behind us, that cocktail party, if you like. But on the other hand, we need to be concentrating on what you and I are speaking about. And that is massively difficult to engineer in a software environment. And if you get it wrong, of course, how do you then make for the machine to unforget? How do you have forgetting routines? How do you toggle between old information and new information? There's this wonderful expression, CACE, it's an aphorism, which is change anything, change everything. If you're changing the parameters, just a slight change of parameter, as we mentioned before, a slight change in the pixelation of what is a tank. So what does a tank look like? It's moving obliquely, it's got a particular RF signature, it's grey, it's got a barrel. But you know what? That's what the data training set understands perhaps as a tank. So therefore, why don't I just paint my turret pink or whatever? And guess what? All of those tanks will be able to, we talked about delegating my right flank to an autonomous weapon. Do you know what? They'll be able to pour through because the machine will not understand that that is within the data set. So it's that unlearning, unforgetting. And also war, we have to remember, is 9/10, 999 thousandths, not doing very much, and then it's utterly chaotic. And the modus operandi of machine learning, of course, is that it's smoothing these long series of data. Nothing happens, and then it's very difficult for the descent gradient, without getting too complicated about a machine learning agent, to understand that that is different from what it has been looking at before. You have endless smoothing such that it reverts to the mean. It doesn't understand inference. It tries to close down, and you have this thing called local minima. So you don't get a solution here. We talked about the utility function. You also have an error function. You're trying to minimize the error function, but that's difficult because we don't want machines to be making unattributed, unaccountable errors. That is not good enough, especially where we're not party to those machines' learning processes there. Smoothing, feint, the configuration. The last thing I'd sort of talk about this, sort of the noise of all of this data, and just generally the overfitting of data. And by the way, if somebody's doing the coding of this, it's the sort of heuristic and biases of that coder within the delivery cohort that I mentioned before. Very difficult to ensure that that doesn't come through and get reflected in what then the machine is doing with its lethal engagements. But the last thing I'd say is that when it comes out of its box on a Tuesday, somebody, of course, has got to configure these weapons. And it's not that Sergeant Major, who this is going to be way over the pay scale of most people in military uniform. So who is doing that? Are you getting a third party in to do that with all the behavioral tics and difficulties of doing that, and who is accountable for that? And of course, your machine, you got the cheaper machine, whereas I bought the more expensive machine. And so as a result, my configuration actually is very different from your configuration. And guess what? It's autonomous. So as soon as it goes behind a hill on, later on that afternoon when it comes out of its box, you are going to be learning at a very different rate from my machine. And so we all have different rates and different errors, and we're going to have to patch these software solutions, which means that the verification and the version control of this is very different because it's in a communications denied environment. So the commander is then suddenly going to have a whole portfolio of different autonomous weapons that he or she have in their setup. And so none of these things I think have been particularly thought about. And how you code for goals and values and the pace of correction and these different learning rates, I think is difficult. Pollinating, when it comes out of its box on a Tuesday, pollinating these machines with its initial representation. So the machine, when it's let loose and off it goes, it's got to have an idea, this representation, its initial idea of where it is, what it's doing, and such like. And without there being a defined end state, this is very difficult to do. That sort of temporal element, are you going to ask it to delay, to resume a task? These are really complicated things to do.
I'm kind of reminded a little bit of this gets more philosophical, but some of the importance of intuition in human thinking and human decision making in uncertain, chaotic situations. And just it seems like even with artificial intelligence, it's very hard to try to replicate that, and particularly like with the contexts and all the various variables that you just mentioned. It kind of reminded me of some of those discussions about they even go back to Plato and Aristotle, like how the mind, the human mind, is not the same as the brain. But in some ways, we're building, but a lot of these weapon systems are built on the premise that the mind and the brain are the same. So thus, artificial intelligence and intelligent human intelligence are one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of whole brain emulation. I go into it in the book in some detail. It looks nice on a piece of paper, but empirically, it is, it's la la land. This is not going to happen anytime soon. Anytime soon, being, I'm reminded of as we spoke about before, the autonomous car. It was promised in 2013 that it's a year away. Fast forward 12 years, it's a year away. It's not a year, these are decades away. It may be possible to go from Poughkeepsie to a nearby one of the suburbs there, but traveling through upstate New York with one of those cars is not going to happen anytime soon, and much the same with these autonomous weapons, I think. So you do need to have this meaningful human control, and why on earth would you not have this human control there, I think.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm from Detroit, the Motor City, and I can tell you, just try to drive around here, even with cruise control, it's difficult enough. You just
Yeah.
constantly have to, just right, somebody just comes out of nowhere or something
Yeah.
happens. It's just, and you always got to rely on that quick human reaction, but also the human intuition that I just mentioned, that in some ways it would be very hard to replicate.
Yeah, and that also is not an adversary. You're not having people doing all sorts of stuff to try and to throw you off. And also, Detroit, nice grid system. Actually, it's quite a bounded environment upon which to have some sort of limited autonomy there, but not in the chaos, as your word, of the battlefield.
Now, you discuss the concept of meaningful human control as a requirement in lethal engagements. how realistic is it to enforce this in an era where military efficiency often prioritizes speed over oversight?
Yeah, so I hope that the book is useful here. So I do come at this from a an ex-military perspective. So I am ex-forces, as I said, but I do have an axe to grind. I sit on the board of an NGO charity here in the UK, which is Article 36. And Article 36 remit is to prevent, to lessen civilian collateral damage in lethal engagements. Good luck with that. But Richard Moyes, who is the really the father of Article 36, has the aphorism "meaningful human control" comes from him, and so the genesis of this is really that killer robots report 13 years ago from Human Rights Watch. And there are several initiatives and directions that have come from this report, but we are still landlocked in the Convention for Conventional Weapons at the United Nations, where, because it's a talking shop, anyone can veto. You have a small cabal of nations who are interested, and there are, after all, by the way, 70 different nations who are working on autonomy in some way or the other. So there's a lot, there's considerable impetus, if you like, not to agree anything. So for me, I think meaningful human control is difficult. What's meaningful? Where does the control happen? If you believe that the key to this is that machine, that weapon's independent targeting, then I think there perhaps is sort of an attack surface, if you like, that you can use to attach some sort of statutory instrument around, and that would be the sort of the targeting profile. So the context is, first of all, that they're very reductive. These machines, they're bound to be, because there's only a certain amount of processing that can actually happen, and there's that necessary reduction of an object to be attacked, if you like, and that has somehow got to match what the autonomous weapon is able to pull through its sensors. So again, using a Venn diagram, you've got to have some configuration and agreement between what is to be attacked, what the machine can see, and what it's allowed to do. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. As we've already talked, it's very difficult to abstract some of this stuff. The data training sets, I mean, good luck with getting that. As you said earlier, war is moving very quickly. A data training set today is going to look hopelessly different from one in 2 weeks, in 4 weeks, in a different battle environment, a different country, a different war setting. There is that smoothing and machine learning being a difficult technical spine here. The biases and heuristics. What is a fact? Is it an indexical fact? Is it a hint? Is it through a Buddhist lens, a Christian lens, a Jewish lens? Is it, good luck with establishing what a fact is, and then being able to code for that without introducing some horrible second order effect because of a bias or heuristic. But I think, nevertheless, if we look at those targeting profiles, you could link some type of ban around those profile monikers. First of all, they must adhere, obviously, to the laws of armed combat and basic moral principles. And if they do that, they mustn't also be mutable. So the profile, the target that you are asking the machine to sort through and identify and then engage, can't itself be mutable and indistinct and morphing. It must be for the purposes of the commander who is deploying these machines, they must be certain that, yes, that is the target that is going to be taken out. It shouldn't be able to target humans, whether that's by gender, by race, or by age, or such like. The profiles should not themselves be mutable. So we talked about the target being mutable. The profile can't be mutable. So you can't update the profile by dint of machine learning and getting additional experience and then going, oh, do you know what? I can slightly morph the profile, because then the responsible commander cannot possibly understand what is happening at the target end, which they must do in order to be compliant with LOAC. It must cover the target profile, a specific area. So a kill box of a loitering weapon or whatever, let's translate that, make it slightly different, but the principle still exists. It must be a bounded area and not just able to move willy-nilly. It must also be of a specific duration, so it's a specific timing, because as we said before, all of these things, proportionality in particular, is dynamic, and it moves with regards to what is a high value target and what is a priority for for upstairs with command or whatever. And these things must be looked at. You can't just anchor these and then just sort of leave them there for days at a time. So specific duration. And the last thing I'd say with that is that the within that ban must be a targeting profile that if it does a lethal engagement, it must then again receive human authentication and authorization before it then goes to the second and third engagement. You can't have, just as you can't have an aggregation of targets, lots of them, nor can you have going from one to the next to the next. So there's something that you might be able to enforce, notwithstanding that you're certainly right, things are moving quicker, and in that equation it's the human that is the weak link there. If I ask you to do something, it takes you 0.3 of a second. If I ask you to do 5 things, it takes you exponentially longer than that, because cognitively we're not so good at that, whereas the machine can do those processes much quicker. And where speed is imperative, especially around decision aids, which we might talk about, then there does become a role for autonomy. But that would seem to be a way that we might consider constraining autonomy.
Now, you spoke of flexible autonomy in the book. Is this kind of related to how meaningful human control can still be maintained on the battlefield, even if the system is somewhat autonomous?
Yeah, it's less really where I talk about it in the book is just the several different adoption mechanisms, and also the environment. So whether that is subsea, where there aren't many humans around, so ideally, you'd have thought that there's going to be less human collateral, and so perhaps more use of autonomy, more legal use of autonomy in that particular environment. So it's when I talk about hybrid, it's talking about colleague machines. So it's that second lieutenant coming out of Sandhurst or West Point and having colleague machines that are helping that individual do the mission. But when things get troublesome and suddenly the human is the bottleneck there, those machines will take on, rather like the phalanx system on the front of your ships. It will it does things. It informs the human operator what's happening until such time as it needs to protect that ship with such speed that actually the human is suddenly a difficult. So that is the sort of the autonomous piece here, and that's really what I'm trying to discuss when it's sort of adoption models here. But it's also, I think, it's interesting to look at hybrid. So automatic, hybrid, autonomous in that continuum. And I talk a lot about there are various continuums here. And I think the continuum that's interesting for us in this conversation today is, so we don't really have autonomous weapon systems as such, whole weapon systems within those 3 assumptions of it being wide capability and wholly independent and compliant with the laws of armed combat. So I think coming along that continuum are those decision aids that we talked about, and whether or not it's the work, the contested work, but nevertheless interesting to read, of Charity plus 972 that have done work on Lavender and Gospel and Where's Daddy and such like. So those autonomous decision aids and the extent to which they are or are not being used to generate targets. And that is a disruption. So before, the IDF, pack of howitzers over the hill, they may or may not be very busy because there was only a certain number of potential targets. But if you are using pattern of life software to be able to identify people and then buildings of interests, and then suddenly you are feeding the those howitzers with a plethora of targets that weren't previously possible. It's then a question of what oversight, where is the human there, where is the accountability, and clearly 12 seconds for a junior operative going, yes, that is legal, that is legal, that is not legal. Probably that is legal. That is very different from actually having meaningful control with a legal advisor and going, yes, that meets the criteria and it meets the collateral damage and it meets all of those thresholds and where you set those thresholds. So I think that is an interesting hybrid development and an autonomous, because these things it's not lethal engagement, but it's certainly coming up with a list of targets that is then dealt with lethally. So that is an unfortunate progression along the continuum. Unfortunate if you are not then having proper supervision to ensure that laws of armed combat are being observed.
Now, one of the book's central premises is that technological advancements often outpace the regulation and ethical frameworks that we were discussing earlier. Do you see any historical parallels and what lessons we can learn from past attempts to regulate disruptive military technology?
Yeah, so this is pretty, it's quite depressing, of course. So, there are, under the Geneva Convention, some gases are prohibited. Dum-dum bullets, I always remember 1899 under the Hague Convention, you're not allowed to use them. That sort of Martin's Clause, which is a delightful construct of words within the dictates of human conscience, hasn't been legally challenged, but that's in there. Biological weapons have been constrained. Environmental modification generally. The one that I like are blinding lasers. No one is doing work on or fielding blinding lasers, really, because of it is beyond the dictates. It's such a horrible thing to have done. The rather sort of non-obvious one is that I cannot engage you with non-detectable fragments, again because you have an MRI or an X-ray and there's the wound, but I can't actually see what is within within the body. So again, with it a bit outside the dictates of human conscience at certain personnel minds. So, but the lessons are, they're not encouraging. And a lot of that stuff I've just gone through is really about the character of war, and it forms norms. So, if that is embraced, that we're not using certain anti-personnel mines or whatever, or today in the press that people are withdrawing from certain of these conventions because they're seeing what's happening in Ukraine and such like, and want not to fetter their militaries. So it is interesting because it does that non-legal but nevertheless sort of behavioral norm and form, and when that is broken, there is then sort of pressure from the other signatories of the Geneva Convention or whatever to bring those parties back to line. So I think the norms which Peter and I dealt with in that first book, I think they are interesting. There are those lots of intangible pressures to re-establish those practices, I think. And what does one do about it? Well, you just have to redouble civil society, I suppose. So it's the free press. It's going against misinformation and disinformation. It's ensuring transparency. It's ensuring the judiciary and accountability. And if that happens, then maybe you'll be the right side of that argument.
You think open source intelligence could also be an aid in trying to get that
Yeah.
transparency?
Yeah, of course, just anything that can counter that misinformation, disinformation piece, whether or not it's hybrid or synthetic, or whether it's done, by human, by bot farms and such like. The next book that I have out with Kirsten Howgate at Howgate Publishing due next year is wars twisting narrative, creation of truth in the conflict realm. So it's all about that OSINT and where we can use that to try and shine the light on these sort of difficult parts that we've discussed.
Now, your book explores the tension between autonomy and accountability, which is the reason why you advocate for meaningful human control. How do you see accountability working in a world where AI-driven weapons may make their own decisions to kill?
So that is the dirty secret of all of this. It's the paradox of all of these autonomous weapon systems, which I try to deal with in the book. And that is the need for human participation all over the deployment of these weapon systems. So it looks as though you're going to have a battlefield with nobody on it, but that is just risible. And again, I go back to that device of the delivery cohort in the book. So we talked about you need the psychologist there, your point about what is cognition and what is learning. You need engineers to do the controlling of that. So I think it's elegant shorthand to talk about all of the wheels, the bits and pieces that make up accountability. It's the logisticians, the roboticists, it's the data engineers and scientists, the lawyers, the companies who are doing this stuff, all of this sort of stuff. We talked about configuration, but it's setting all of those thresholds. They're not done robotically. Of course, they're done manually. They're done with people. Now, whether that is the coder or, of course, the local commander, all of that is vitally important. How do these things fail? Do they fail safe? In other words, when internally something is amiss, do they just close themselves down and fail safe? Or do they carry on with their mission? Well, of course, they can't carry on with their mission. But on the other hand, if you're that local commander, he or she who's delegated the right flank, you don't want those machines suddenly to stop for some exogenous reason. We talked about all that nullification and the likely low-tech ways of disturbing your autonomous weapon system. So, alternatively, the other part of that continuum is you can't just have them you fail. So it is all about humans. It is about that team culture. And within the delivery cohort, you've got to be jolly sure that there isn't collective blindness, that there is constructive dissent, that, you've got all of that thing. And the resulting weapon system, were it ever to be deployed, is properly accretive.
Now, you highlight that technological progress is often chaotic and non-linear. Are there any major roadblocks, technological, political, or economic, that you believe could slow down or even prevent the widespread deployment of autonomous weapon systems?
So I think we've touched on some of the technical difficulties here. So I'm not going to repeat that. I'm just going to suggest the key ones, which I suppose is, to the extent that there's, as I said before, original input in this book. I hope that this brings it out writ large, and that is, there is no definable end state for these machines. So we talked about local minima and such like, but how often are you going to pull new data for these machines? Do you do it every minute, every 5 minutes, every second? Because that's clearly got huge ramifications for how you're managing this, for the amount of power you need, for all of these sorts of things. There's this notion called anchoring. So when I have received that data from my sensors, anchoring is the degree to which I am changing that initial representation. So the modus operandi of the machine at that time, how much are you changing it to account for what is suddenly being sensed? And suddenly being sensed might be the forward LiDAR that sees that there's a hole in the ground and you've got to move the machine 30 degrees to the left. Well, anchoring, does that mean that every time you come across a hole in the ground, you're always going to change 30 degrees to the left? It's that sort of degree of change management that no work is being done at the moment, whether on the university workbench or commercially. And I think that is, without that, you don't really have you can't have that weapons autonomy. We talked about the unforgetting or the forgetting. You can't have it unforgetting because then you have this catastrophic forgetting. But if you're trying to unlearn a routine and you get that wrong, you've toggled between old data, new data, and you've got that wrong. That is going to have, and of course, these are lethal machines. So it is, it is a catastrophic failure that is going to happen. So it's those 10 nuns, 12 children sitting on a bridge. That is the ethical equation that is often quoted. Well, that just goes to rack and ruin with that. Coding errors. I talk a lot in the book about how often an error is pops up with coding and whether or not this is for NASA, sending things up into the sky. It's extraordinary how many error points there are. And we talked about whole brain emulation. If the same physics of errors and the number of synaptic connections that you have to make in order to start thinking about within the machine learning environment, having a sentient with a very small s, but certainly independent weapon that understands from a known case to the present case to the future case, the number of mistakes that are going to be amplified in that. And bearing in mind that, and again, in a communications denied environment, who is going to be correcting that stuff? And then does it just, if it's not efficient and efficacious, then do you know what? Have a human there. So I don't really understand why you wouldn't do that. Just that whole notion, I think, the difficulty of this machine learning is based around an incentive, so the utility function, a stick, if you like, the carrot and the stick. So the carrot is the utility function, the stick is the error function, and it must work first time and every time, which is difficult for this being a probabilistic approximator. We have lots of smell tests as human that we just know that something isn't quite right. That is very, very difficult to code for. And the last thing I'd say here, I'd just reinforce again with that data set, they don't have nice shiny sides, edges to all of the bits of sense data. It's very difficult to abstract. And if you can't abstract nice labeled, understandable pieces of data that you can then take forward into a decision process, that decision waterfall, just falls away. So they're to me, the technical pieces. Politically, I think difficult. Someday politics goes up and down. This thing needs a long runway, and it also needs a lot of false starts. So whether or not the politics, then it'll probably proliferate and it'll escalate. And if I've got it but you don't have it, and I look across the border and you're about to have it, is there therefore a strategic imperative that I therefore use my autonomous weapons to take out yours? So there's all sorts of ethical strategic issues. It's not just at the tactical level where this becomes complicated, the more because of plausible deniability, and parties are either shielding it in secret and I'm not telling you what I'm doing, or I'm obfuscating or I'm exaggerating or whatever. So it's a very uneven, unforgiving environment to which these will be deployed.
Now, also what we have been seeing, especially even in the war in Ukraine, is that we're seeing not just purely military technology, but also commercial technology being utilized for military purposes. How do you see corporate and commercial interests shaping the future of warfare and especially the development of autonomous weapons?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, well, let's just set autonomous weapons aside as just one subset of all of that. It's really, really important, isn't it? In olden days, when I was running about the battlefield, somebody would put in a tender request for a tank, and it would go, guess what, from procurement up to here in the UK, up to Newcastle, where a tank would appear 8 months later. Very different now. So that was a pull strategy. Very today, the the adoption metrics are very different. It is the dual use nature of the smartphone environment. So, and that's got lots of ramifications. First of all, extraordinary R&D budgets, and right at the sort of cutting edge of target recognition, automatic target recognition. In olden days, it used to be quite difficult for a machine to understand that one pencil was different from another pencil, and if there's lots of pencils moving about, that is no longer a constraint, really, because of the work that has been done in that around smartphones. And then I'd go back to that, so certainly dual use batteries, scavenging power, lots of different ways of doing power nowadays. The degrees of freedom. So in olden days, it used to be quite difficult to have a two-legged robot with quite a low center of gravity. Now, with degrees of freedom work and such like, that's been overcome. So obviously, the role of the commercial sector with LiDAR, with navigation, these are all ubiquitous, no longer considerations. I'd probably point to some of these very highly capitalized, valuable private companies now who are working around that, the gospel lavender pattern of life stuff with those autonomous aids that we were talking about. So, at the moment in the ground, they have got very useful product. If we look at Palantir, Gotham, Foundry, whatever, that are incredibly useful at preventative maintenance, understanding, getting the command and control to understand what assets are available to them at any point in time, and doing nice sort of scenario planning in order to work out what's the most efficient way of undertaking a particular part of combat. Now, there again, another continuum. There's quite a slide there from then being able with satellites and such like to scan the battlefield and come up with clever ideas about how targeting can be bunched, aggregated, made much quicker. You can scrape from from social media, and suddenly there's whole new areas of criteria that can be baked into those targets, and so that target selection. So maybe that's more efficient. I haven't seen the attribution analysis that proves that, but certainly, as we've talked about at length, there is a whole quantum difference of presentable targets. So that's work that's come entirely from the commercial parties, and you'll definitely see that. So in Ukraine, for instance, that you mentioned, if we look at there's a VC called D3, and their portfolio is all sorts of different drone technology. So that undoubtedly has been a discontinuity on the battlefield, different ways of killing people, not necessarily a revolution in military affairs, but it's been commercially led, and you're suddenly getting the impetus of smart private equity, venture capital, private money into that. So all of that thing, you're absolutely right to point it out.
Now, some proponents argue that autonomous weapons could lead to a, quote, cleaner, end quote, warfare with fewer civilian casualties. Given your research, do you see any merit in this argument, or is it just another myth of technological utopianism?
Well, so you're right. Stephen and I, we come out of West Point. We are in Fallujah. I don't know where we are. We're in a difficult environment. When you and I are presented with uncertainty, something happens, we are ethically poor, empirically, and it's difficult to do research on this because anyone filling in a questionnaire around ethics, there's all sorts of biases and heuristics in how you ask the questions or whatever. But generally, one would think that a machine which is very conservatively programmed, that doesn't have to protect itself. If we look at the work of Ronald Arkin at Georgetown in the 90s and early 2000s, the notion of this sort of ethical governor. So you can slave this governor to your autonomous weapon system, and it won't actually dispense lethality until it's gone through that waterfall of decisions around the ethics. And so you'd think that on a piece of paper that would be would be sensible, and humans are otherwise poor. The OODA loop, the Boyd loop, or whatever. We're operationally quite slow, and with pattern recognition and repeatability, guess what? The machine is always going to be much better. So lots of reasons why the humans are poor, but then anchored with this revolution in expectation, it does not equate necessarily to humans being much, much better. So to me, I'm on the technological utopianism probably. And because it's this adversarial, difficult, tricky, muddy environment of the battlefield, it's the myth at the moment. Certainly, tactically, having machines on the ground doing specific stuff on their own, I can't see that happening anytime soon.
Yes, in his recent book, Humane War, Samuel Moyn addressed this question, mostly in terms of drone warfare. But he kind of said, yeah, the idea was to make war more humane and, keep people away from it. But then what happens is one of the major consequences is it led to, the common phrase forever wars. It actually prolongs the war. It actually just means more people actually get killed in the end. So it's actually there's again that's
Yeah.
expectation versus the reality.
Yeah, and people are all over this, aren't they? So the delivery cohort we've talked about, but we're going to somehow have to factor for permissions and authorizations and thresholds. And at the moment, we have this quite trusted ecosystem. How are you going to somehow capture that in code and then let machines do that? The whole notion of trust. So I, as that second left, you and I, that second lieutenant, when we're out of West Point and we've got these colleague machines, it relies on trust, doesn't it, for you to delegate tasks to those machines. And of course, it's all got to be backed up by training. Good luck with that, and doctrine, and all. I think there's so many intangibles that you can't code for. The command intangibles. How do you ask the machine to estimate? How do you task the machine? How do you assign tasks to that machine? How do you ask it to formulate plans and do so such that you can really trust that? You're not going to have comradeship with these machines. You're certainly not asking these machines for any initiative. So that's still got to come from these machines, which, by the way, I hope aren't going to be hacked and then taken over. Would you rather look, Stephen? It boils down to the fact: would you rather have good men or good people or good kit? And actually, so this we've been talking about is the good kit bit. You always want to have good people there. That sort of yeah. So and the complexity also, I think, with the people element. They can then veto stuff. The complexity of trying to introduce a veto into an autonomous weapon is just legion, and I can't see that. I can't see that happening. It's really as how you police these things, I don't know, but generally, as uncertainty goes up, and what could be more uncertain than the battlefield, I think the value of this sort of utility as a tool, it undoubtedly goes down, and that has not been recognized by people looking at these autonomous weapon systems and whether or not they can be deployed. And then the last thing I'd say, they are physical things, these weapon systems, regardless if they're autonomous or not. So they've got a certain signature, they need logistics, they've got to go over terrain, they've got to be replenned and serviced, and you've got, all of this sort of stuff. And how is that going to happen? again it's just those unbelievably simple practicalities that no one is sort of writing about. And by the way, with the sort of ubiquitous sensor on the battlefield, everything is now discoverable. So it's not a question anymore of withdrawing those autonomous weapons, which you can't speak to anyway, into some sort of rear echelon, and everything is seeable. So yeah, so many bits there that's just I can't see how it's going to work.
And also, there's this premise that these autonomous weapons are just somehow invincible. They'll just dominate the battlefield. But as the war in Ukraine demonstrates, you do have the ability to conceive of countermeasures. And what has the war in Ukraine taught us so far about how these systems can be countered?
Yes, so I mean, extraordinary. In my day, way back in the late 80s, 90s, when you had your tanks on the inner German border for whatever division was coming across from Russia, the Red Force, we had Milan, which was a wire-guided missile that went out. I can't remember, went out to 2 kilometers or some such. Your listeners will know better than I. But extraordinary. Roll forward to 2025, and suddenly you're having drones now with wires, because that is one way that you can ensure that in a communications denied environment you can communicate ubiquitously with your drone and get it to do what you want it to do. But to answer your question, it's uh, so so there's this thing called which I talk about a lot in the book, SIBA's it's sort of metrics of adoption, and so if you look today, we talked about D3 with Ukraine, half the portfolio is in drone countermeasures. Had you looked at that a year ago, it would all be about drones. So of course you are getting countermeasures, and how you're getting that, you're getting grabbers, you're getting electromagnetic pulses, you're getting over the spectrum, you're getting hacking, you're getting all sorts of things. The easiest way to actually attack these things is just before they come out of the box. So in fact, you're having behind the line infiltration and operations. So you're absolutely right, which is why it is not a revolution in military affairs. It is something that had its moment and will definitely ongoing have its moment, but there are now countermeasures for these things. So it's this leapfrogging, and going back to your point about the commercial entities, there's money in being ahead of that curve. So yes, private equity and private capital will always be trying to get a new way of doing it. And that is why you need a human on the battlefield. So I think it's quite a neat way to sort of conclude, actually. It is warfare without, war without oversight. But actually, humans are all around it, and there to stay.
Now, throughout history, warfare has always been shaped by human instincts, emotions, and even errors. And we've talked about this quite a bit throughout the interview. If we remove human agency from this process, do you see any possible unintended consequences that people, especially advocates for autonomous weapons, are not really considering?
Yeah, I mean, the second order effects of these are too difficult to contemplate. I mean, I mentioned the sort of the difficult notions of escalation and proliferation. So, if I have it and you don't, am I going to use it against you? You've used it against me, but you've said you haven't. Oh my goodness, that is geopolitically very destabilizing, which leads to all sorts of second order effects. So anything that isn't accountable, isn't transparent, isn't well telegraphed, it does lead to those second order effects and the instability around that. And I think just generally the generally febrile nature of the battlefield. It used to be much more constrained, and there is the battlefield, and I'm wearing a red coat, and I'm Edwardian, and I'm whatever. Nowadays, much more difficult to understand what is an adversary, what isn't, what is difficult, and what is part of a hybrid program against me, and what isn't. So I think that drone and the plethora of tasking and I'm not now including autonomous, I'm just saying generally where you've got these machines, that the extraordinary breadth of tasking that they can do, that is generally destabilizing. And if you then remove humans from that, then of course you have those second order effects, which are difficult to understand and make everyone more jumpy.
Now, is there like one non-negotiable principle that you would consider for regulating autonomous weapon systems, and what would that be and why?
Yeah, so I can answer that quite quickly. I like the target profiles piece because I think if you are able to limit and constrain and understand what these machines are targeting, then that then just becomes another part of the adversary or your arsenal. So I like that meaningful human control, but then I think to explain that further, it goes down to the target profiles and monikers that are being programmed in these machines and constraining their breadth.
Well, this has been a very fascinating discussion. Do you have any final thoughts? Maybe cover anything in the book that we didn't cover in the main discussion?
No, thank you for allowing me to discuss it. The elevator pitch is that the challenges to the deployment of autonomous weapon systems are properly enduring and systemic. They are foundational here. These things will come to pass, I'm sure, but not as currently posited with machine learning and some data training set that informs how these machines will work. So it's going to have to be a rethink, and please don't underestimate the behavioral inertia that must be overcome in order for these actually to be deployed on the battlefield, which to my mind is not anytime soon.
Well, we always like to end our discussions with asking our guests, what are you working on now? And you did mention that a little earlier, but if you want to go into more details.
Yeah, so our next talk, Stephen, will probably be in a little more than a year's time. So I've just started this third work, which is just going to reiterate the title again, if I may, Wars, Twisting Narratives, Creation of Truth in the Conflict Realm. And so it's looking at that misinformation and disinformation piece. I'm an associate at the Imperial War Museum here in the UK, London and elsewhere, and I think that is, the whole disinformation and where individuals are getting their information from, and the degree to which that is being filtered and understood before those individuals are then making decisions about resilience, decisions about what they would do in a war, what they think the government should be doing for them in a conflict, time of conflict, all of these things, and how it can be manipulated. So I think that is the next frontier here. We talked about OSINT briefly, but I think the autonomous use, the synthetic use of disinformation and misinformation to create narratives, and the destruction that that can do in societies. I'm looking forward to doing that book and to coming back and discussing it with you, Stephen.
Yeah, we definitely would love to have you back. Now, would you say artificial intelligence has some role in like disinformation and misinformation operations?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. All over it. So, all over it. Wait for the book.
Yes, definitely. Well, we'll definitely have you back on the podcast. Patty Walker, thank you for joining us on the New Books Network.
Stephen, it's a great honor and thank you very much. And I'm sure that you will tell your listeners how to be purchasing these books. Many thanks indeed.
Absolutely.